Okay, so we're going to begin now. Good morning, everyone. Shavua Tov. Thank you for joining us once again. Fascinating presentation delivered by Dr. Barry Eichler, who has a long and distinguished career. And Dr. Eichler currently is a professor of Bible and cuneiform studies at Yeshiva University. Prior to that, he was a professor of Assyriology at the University of Pennsylvania for 40 years, and in the Department of Near Eastern Language and Civilizations. He is also the founder of the Penn University's Jewish Studies program, and he serves as the chair of that program for many years. I think I know, we all know people who have participated in that program, a very distinguished program. And Dr. Eichler was the founder of that program. He did serve as the dean of Yeshiva College not too long ago, which is even, as he explained to me, even a more challenging position, because in the past he was only responsible for a specific department, and then he was responsible for the academics of the entire Yeshiva College, which is the men's division of Yeshiva University. He taught at Penn Law School. He was a fellow. He had the fellowship at Yale University, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Needless to say, he is a highly accomplished man of great scholarship. The most important, above all that, is the fact that he is also a fully devout man and a person who demonstrates incredible character, sparkling midos. Anyone who knows him can immediately attest to the fact that he is both humble and refined, and his character truly shines. You know, despite all his accomplishments, he somehow was able to maintain a certain beauty of character as well. We all know that their children, Rabbi and Esti Abadi, are well known to us in the Upper East Side and continue to do great work amongst the Jewish world. And we only wish them, Barry and Linda, only wish them health and happiness and much success. And it's a great honor to have you both a part of our community these past number of years. Dr. Eichler's presentation this morning is a fascinating presentation. You know, he has an expertise in the cultural interrelationship between biblical and ancient Near Eastern civilizations. So what does that mean? Basically means that, you know, we have Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, our forefathers. They lived at a certain time in history. And if we understand the background of the civilization during their lifetimes, we understood, you know, the law of the ancient world and the culture of the ancient world, we could have new insights into Judaism and the Bible and the Torah as to what the Torah comes to teach us. So we're basically going to get a glimpse into the ancient culture during Abraham's time, and an insight how Torah law is related to what occurred way back when. You know, very few people out there have an expertise in this area, could deliver such a lecture. It's a great honor for us to call upon Dr. Eichler this morning. There will be an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. You can either type it in. Any questions, we're happy to relay these questions to Dr. Eichler at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much for all your efforts and your time last night that you did to put this all together for us.
Right. Thank you very much, Rabbi Babich, for your very generous introduction. And I hope that people will find Torah and the ancient Near East as fascinating as I do. All right. As an Assyriologist, I study the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, which invented the first writing system in human history, known as cuneiform writing. This civilization was created by the people who inhabited the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, the land of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, corresponding to modern-day Iraq. Now, I just wanted to get, okay, there we go. All right, so so here is the Tigris over here and the Euphrates. And this whole area from the Persian Gulf all the way up to the Anatolian Plateau and covering parts of Syria, all belong to people who participated in the development of the Mesopotamian civilization. Okay. And that area actually is this part here, which basically encompasses most of Iraq, plus parts of Syria and parts of Jordan. And eventually, the Mesopotamian empires actually conquered Egypt in the heyday of their hegemony, world hegemony. And this is an example of some cuneiform writing that you have, which I will be referring to again. So although this region has been inhabited by different non-Semitic and Semitic ethnic groups, these people created and shared a cultural heritage, which is called Mesopotamian civilization. The task of the Assyriologist is to reconstruct biblical civilization on the basis of data gleaned from clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing, which has continued to be unearthed by archaeologists during the last 150 years. You may rightfully ask, what kind of profession is this for a nice Jewish boy? So, as I reminded my father-in-law many years ago, let us remind ourselves that Mesopotamian civilization played an important role in the formative period of the history of the Jewish people during the biblical period and beyond. Mesopotamia was the home of the patriarchs Abraham Avinu, was born there. It gave Yitzchak his wife Rivka. Yaakov fled there to escape the wrath of Esav and married Mesopotamian women, Leah and Rachel. The patriarchal narratives, which are recorded in the weekly Torah portions we are presently reading, reflect socio-legal and economic institutions documented in Mesopotamian texts. These cuneiform texts attest to the practice of barren women giving her hand barren women giving her handmaiden to her husband to sire an heir, to the important role of the brother as a protector of his sister, as well as detailed herding contracts which help to clarify the tensions that arose between Yaakov and Lavan. During the period of the divided monarchy, both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah interacted with Mesopotamian political powers and their cultural religious influences. The kingdom of Israel paid tribute to the Mesopotamian state of Assyria. And as you can see here, we have such a monument which describes the giving of tribute to King Yehu of Israel before Shalmaneser III, which is on the upper register of this black monolith, which is preserved in museums today. And there it very clearly states Yahu, the King of Israel. So that is just one of many, many royal monuments and inscriptions that we have. Also, it was the Assyrian Empire, Assyrian state rather, which eventually destroyed the kingdom of Israel, deported and dispersed the 10 tribes throughout their far-flung empire. The kingdom of Judah fell to the Mesopotamian state of Babylonia, and with the destruction of the first temple and subsequent exile, Jews found themselves once again in Mesopotamia. During the Persian period, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews returned to the land of Israel. Despite the return to Zion, the Jewish Mesopotamian diaspora, with strong ties to the land of Israel, continued to grow and prosper. And with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans and the continued persecution of the Jewish community in Israel following that destruction, Babylonian Jewry in Mesopotamia became the center of Torah study within its academies in the Babylonian cities of Nehardai, Mahoza, Pumbedita, and Sura. It was Babylonian Jewry that produced the Babylonian Talmud. Today, with the advent of archaeology and Assyriology as full-fledged disciplines, and the subsequent rediscovery of the pre-classical ancient world, we now have a unique opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of and a richer appreciation of the content, nature, and message of the Torah when studied within the context of the ancient Near East. This is especially true in the realm of law, since Mesopotamian law was one of the most potent cultural forces in the ancient world, and its influence is evident in all of the neighboring cultures. For this reason, the study of biblical law against the backdrop of Mesopotamian law should prove to be instructive. But before turning our attention to Torah law, we need to think about the concept of law as it relates to culture. From an anthropological or sociological perspective, law is the subset of a society's social normative behavior. A social norm becomes a legal norm if it is enforced not merely by social pressure, but by socially authorized sanctions. So defined, law is to be understood as an integral part of the total fabric of a society's culture and reflects the basic cultural postulates of the society it regulates. Since law embodies those norms which are to be upheld most consistently within society, and which society demands that they be observed by threat of legal sanction, legal norms are a very important key to understanding the basic cultural values of any given society. For example, law is one of the most revealing indicators of the basic cultural values of the society. For example, if you wanted to understand some of the most basic cultural values of American society, then you just have to open up the Constitution, which is its basic legal text, and find there freedom in the First Amendment. Congress shall not make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So freedom of religion, speech, press, and the right of assembly and petition are basic cultural values within American society. Law also allows for a clearer appreciation of a society's cultural values at any given time within its history. For example, think about the American Declaration of Independence, which declares, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Surely this document speaks of the cultural values of the young American Republic. But what we must remember that this proclamation is not a legal document, but rather a propagandistic declaration of war. Its purpose was to justify to the European world, why the America declared war against England by explaining the nobility of its bellicose action and to garner support for its noble cause from its own citizenry and from people abroad. To really understand the true nature of the American cultural values as reflected in the Declaration of Independence, which actually underlie this declaration, we must look to law, to American law once again. When we look at the 13th Amendment, which is the one that abolishes slavery, the 15th Amendment, which rights are not to be denied on account of race, and later on in 1920 to the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. we see that all men are created equal has evolved over time as a value that has been interpreted uh, and discussed and pushed more forward throughout the steps of the history of American society. And so therefore, we now can see the evolution of the declaration, all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights. And we find this evolution documented in American law. Another way in which law helps us better understand a society's cultural value is by means of examining its legal sanctions. Legal sanctions allow us to determine the relative importance of societal values within the value system of a particular society. In other words, a more severe punishment for an act which defies a cultural value within the society is a sure indication of the greater importance which that society places on the safeguarding of that cultural value. Penalties for private wrongs committed against individuals will be expressed in terms of compensation to the victim. Penalties for criminal wrongs against the society as a whole and its most basic values will underscore the degree of the society's outrage and intolerance of such behavior, expressed in terms of fines, incarceration, and capital punishment. Law may also reveal law may reveal the socioeconomic political tensions that play out within a society. For example, a close reading of a particular law often allows one to see the various forces at play and to sense the tensions within the society. As you can see with the legal issues that arise with regard to the law that's established with regard to abortion, is basically this tension between a private right, the right of a woman over her body, versus a societal issue as to the degree of the societal obligation to protect unborn life. To sum up then the relationship between law and society, I've tried to show that law is one of the most revealing indicators of the basic cultural values of a society. Law allows for a clearer appreciation and understanding of a society's cultural values at any given time within its history. Law is an indicator of the relative importance of a society's cultural values, and law may reveal social political tensions within society. Since law is an aspect of culture, a society's law cannot be studied in a vacuum, but must be placed within the framework of a society's cultural worldviews and its basic cultural postulates. In turning our attention then to Mesopotamian law, we must have a basic understanding of the Mesopotamian society's worldview. And so I would like to go over some of the Mesopotamian aspects of the Mesopotamian worldview that pertain to law. The gods were born into a cosmos which is governed by pre-existing natural and supernatural forces. The gods, like humankind, are subject to these cosmic forces of the universe. The world as we know it was created from primordial matter by the head of the pantheon. He appointed the major gods to be guardians of the cosmic forces, and he gave them temple estates on earth. Humankind was created to be the slave of the great gods, building temple manors on earth for the great gods, and cultivating the temple lands to provide for the physical needs of the gods. The role of the divinely chosen human king was to serve as a bridge and between the divine and earthly realms. Uh, that leads us to understand a little bit better the notion of Mesopotamian law. Mesopotamians conceived of law as a cosmic force in the universe, which keeps the cosmos in balance. Uh, cosmic truth, known as kitum, which means fundamental truths, from like Cain, meaning yes or firm, is the source of law, which is designed to establish misharum, like yosher, equity on earth. Shamash is one of the great Mesopotamian kings. He is gods. He is the sun god, who is not the origin of law, but he is the custodian of the cosmic force of law, of kitum. And therefore, he knows the intricate insights that are important for the understanding of kitum, this cosmic truth. The king, who is the human author of specific laws, Hammurabi says that he is writing his dinatu, his laws. If the king's laws, these dinatu, these dinim, reflect the principle of kitum, then misharum will be established in the land. And it is the king who is responsible for the socioeconomic well-being of his subjects. As we see here, we have the Code of Hammurabi. We have a picture of Hammurabi in a picture of with his hands raised in obeisance to the god. Shamash, you can tell that Shamash is a god because he has this horned helmet that he's wearing. It's hard to see that, but that's a horned helmet of some kind. And he is giving the rod and ring of kingship, symbols of royal authority, to Hammurabi. Since Hammurabi has been divinely chosen to rule, he, by virtue of his office, bears the responsibility to be a just ruler and implement equity in the land. The king is charged to protect the weak and orphaned and widowed from the abuse of more powerful elements within society. But unlike the Torah's understanding of the law as the divine will of Hashem, offered to Bnei Yisrael as a divine blueprint for human conduct, in Mesopotamia, the source of the law and the authorship of the law are two separate concepts. The law stems not from a divine source, but from this abstract cosmic principle of truth. And the king authors his own laws, which are inscribed in the stela monument. All around it contains over 300 different laws. And the hope that his dinati that are inscribed on the stela will reflect the cosmic principle of kitum. Okay. Finally, a word about Torah. As religious Jews, we believe in the eternity of the written law, and that it is the oral law which guarantees that the eternal message of Torah will be preserved, transmitted across generations, and be relevant to us even today. On the other hand, we realize that the Torah was revealed to Bnei Yisrael at a certain particular juncture in human history. Its eternal message, therefore, was cloaked in the contextual garb of a particular time period, so that its recipients would be capable of understanding its message. Its message had to be delivered within the cultural framework of the times. And in that sense, the Torah is time-bound. By understanding this cultural framework, we'll be able to better appreciate the unique message of the Torah. With this goal in mind, I have chosen to explore one Torah law this morning with you, which will allow us to see the ways in which the knowledge of Mesopotamian culture may enhance our understanding of both the written and oral Torah, the Torah Shebechtav and the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That is the law of the wayward and defiant son, Ben Sorer Umoreh. We'll read it together, or you have it up there. If a man has a disloyal and defiant son who does not heed his father or his mother and does not obey them, even after they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of the town, "This son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He is a wastrel and a drunkard." Thereupon the men of the city shall stone him to death. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. When reading this law once a year in shul, I must admit that some of us tend to hear it with a kind of religious indifference. To be sure, this biblical law deals with parental authority and filial disobedience and underscores the Torah's cultural value of the centrality of family in Jewish society, which requires respecting parental authority. But the details of the law do not seem to command our attention. In order to enhance our appreciation of this biblical message in this Torah law, let us try to understand the nature of patriarchal authority in the ancient Near East. And so we will discuss from a collection of laws, none of them exactly like the laws of the wayward and defiant son, but we were trying to here explore the nature of patriarchal authority over one's wife and minor children. In the laws of adultery, we read, Laws of Hammurabi 129, if a man's wife is seized lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water. If the woman's husband wishes to spare his wife, the king shall spare his subject. And this is re-echoed. The Code of Hammurabi is basically dated to the patriarchal period. And we have dated to the period of around the establishment of the kingship in Israel, a Middle Assyrian set of laws, and in it, it states that if a man has caught another man upon his wife, and the charges are substantiated against them, they may both be killed with no liability attaching to the husband. If upon catching them, he has brought him before the king or the judges, and they have found him guilty, if the husband puts his wife to death, the man shall also be put to death. If the husband cuts off his wife's nose, he shall turn the man into a eunuch. But if he lets his wife go free, he shall let the man go free. What we find here is basically the absolute authority of the patriarch, of the husband, the patriarch of the family, to have life and death control over his wife. He may deal with her as he wants. He may kill her, he may pardon her, or he may inflict some kind of physical disfacement and punishment for her. And as we see that despite the fact that Mesopotamians were no longer basically living within tribal clans, but rather there was a polity headed by a king who asserted his authority in many different ways, including the issuing of laws and taxes and numerous other ways. But we see that there is a diffidence here on the part of the king to interfere with any aspect of patriarchal authority over his wife. The only thing that the king can do is demand in both the laws of Hammurabi and in the Middle Assyrian laws that since the paramour is really the king's subject, then the king interferes into this private matter by demanding that the subject be treated in accordance to the way the husband treats his wife. In other words, there is no interference with patriarchal authority, but rather there is the injection of the king to assure the fact that his subject would be treated in accordance with the same punishment that the wife of the man will that the husband will decree upon his wife. Okay. Another example of the tension that we have, where the king refuses to get involved in patriarchal authority over one's children, is demonstrated by the laws of Hammurabi in 154. If a man has carnal relations with his daughter, they shall ban that man from the city. Clearly, Hammurabi does not like that practice, and he thinks that it should not be committed. However, instead of having a law that would outlaw such behavior, he nevertheless seems powerless. All he can say is that I cannot interfere with your patriarchal authority over your daughter, but I will say that we don't tolerate that in my kingdom. And so if you continue to have carnal relations with your daughter, then you will be banished with your household and the entire, all of your possessions from our city. Again, patriarchal authority over one's daughter is basically complete. We also have evidence that this was true also for a son. If a builder constructs a house for a man but does not make his work sound, so that the house collapses and causes the death of the householder, that builder shall be killed. If it causes the death of the son of the householder, they shall kill the son of that builder. So what we derive from here is that the son is considered merely the property, the extension and property of the father or the head of the household, the patriarch, and that his life has no protection by the state whatsoever, and basically the builder can, in fact, basically the law recognizes that if the son of the householder dies, then the king's law is that the son of that builder shall be killed in lieu of the builder. And that is because Mesopotamia law has this value that the best punishment is let the punishment fit the crime. And therefore, in these cases, it advocates vicarious punishment, in which the son caused the death of the householder, and therefore the crown will kill the son of the builder. But in any case, we see here that the son is merely the extension or property of his father. So when we look at the Mesopotamian societal values that we see from these laws, we see the absolute authority of the pater familias over the wife and minor children, who are viewed as the property of the head of the household. There's an economic valuation of human life, evidenced by the laws of homicide, which allows for monetary compensation. And this is in keeping with the fact that the task of man, the reason human beings were created, was to serve as the slave of the gods. There is the idea of vicarious punishment as the ideal retribution. And we also see that adultery is viewed as a private wrong against the husband and is not considered to be a societal wrong. Okay, now let us return to our laws, and since we and reread them, keeping in the mind that when the Israelites heard this law, they were aware of the absolute nature of patriarchal authority in their own times. Taken its ancient Near Eastern context to which we too are now privy, certain aspects of this law of Ben Soreru Moreh now stand out with greater clarity. So let's see what we see. If we look at these and really pay attention to the words, we see certain words now based on a background that are unexpected. If a man has a disloyal and defiant son who does not heed his father, all of a sudden we see the mother is introduced and does not obey them even after they discipline him. His father and his mother, as equal partners, shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his town at the public place of his community. They shall say to the elders of the town, "This son of ours is disloyal and defiant. He does not heed us. He's a wastrel and a drunkard." Now, we see here that in addition to the father's authority, he now has the deal with the authority of a mother over her child. And even the mother and father cannot have complete control over the fate and destiny of their son, because they must bring them to the elders of the town that served as the judiciary. And it's up to the elders of the town to listen to their charge against their son. And there's a legal process that which will then follow. And after the conclusion of that legal process, if the child is guilty of the crime of being a disloyal and defiant son, then he shall be stoned to death, not by the father, not by the mother, but the men of his city. And thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. All Israel will hear and be afraid. So what we see here then, after carefully reading the text once more, the issue of filial disobedience is no longer a private family matter in which the father wields absolute authority. The concurrence of the mother comes clearly into play, as well as the public role of the elders of the community, which limit the absolute authority of the father. Only the men of the community have the right to execute the son after the deliberations of the elders. In this light, the essential purport of the Torah is quite different from what we had imagined before. If you're with me and agree, I would say that the essential purpose of the Torah is to protect the child from the absolute and capricious authority of his father, even as it seeks to strengthen parental authority by deterring filial insubordination, which undermines the stability of its society and the transmission of its values. So therefore, what we discover with knowledge and awareness of what was ancient Near Eastern societal practice and the absolute authority of the patriarch over family matters, we can see that the purpose of this Torah law is to protect the child from the authority of his father, the absolute authority of his father. And now if we look at the oral law, we find some very interesting passages. We find in the Mishnaic, the Mishnahs in Sanhedrin chapter 8, which deals with the laws of Ben Sorer Umoreh, a series of restrictions for the application of this law. Its limits, as we see here, the first Mishnah, Mishnah Aleph, limits the time in which a child can be charged with being a stubborn and rebellious son. And they say, from when does a stubborn and rebellious son become liable to receive the death penalty imposed upon a stubborn and rebellious son? From when he grows two pubic hairs, which are a sign of puberty, and from which time he is considered an adult, until he has grown a beard around. The reference here is to the lower beard surrounding his genitals and not the upper beard, as the Mishnah tells us, because the sages spoke in euphemistic terms. And the reason for this restriction is based on the verse, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son, which indicates that the penalty for rebelliousness is imposed upon a son, but not upon a daughter, and upon a son, but not upon a fully grown man. A minor under the age of 13 is exempt from the penalty imposed upon a stubborn and rebellious son because he has not yet reached the age of inclusion in the mitzvot. And so there is a very short period of time, perhaps 3 months, in which the law of the stubborn and rebellious son can be applied. And then we see that there are further restrictions as well. If we look at Mishnah 4 in the 8th parak of Sanhedrin, it goes on to say, if his father wishes to have him punished, but his mother does not wish that, or if his father does not wish to have him punished, but his mother wishes that, he does not become a stubborn and rebellious son unless they both wish that he be punished. That's exactly how we read the text. Rabbi Yehuda said, if his mother was not suited for his father, he does not become a stubborn and rebellious son. If one of the parents was without hands, or lame, or mute, or blind, or deaf, their son does not become a stubborn and rebellious son. As it is stated, they shall, then shall his father and mother lay hold of him and bring him to the elders of the city gate, to the gate of his place. And they shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voices. He is a glutton and a drunkard. The sages derive, then shall his father and mother lay hold of him, refers to people who are with hands, but people who are not with hands cannot do this, and therefore their son could never be brought up on charges of a ben sorer umoreh. Similarly, it says, and bring him out, but not lame people, because they cannot walk, so they cannot charge their son with this offense. And they shall say, but not mutes. Parents who are mutes cannot at all bring charges against their son. And then they say, this son of ours, pointing to the son, shows that they are not blind. People who can point to their son and say this are the only ones who can point to their son and say, this one here is subject to being charged as a rebellious son. And he will not obey our voices, but not deaf people who cannot hear whether or not he declined to obey them. So if we go further in the Talmud, these discussions lead to a discussion, and these restrictions in the Mishnah lead us to a discussion in the Talmud Bavli in Sanhedrin 71a, which states that the Braita states there never has been an adjudicated case of a disloyal and defiant son, and never will be. And so there is another opinion that testifies that it had happened in the past, but by and large, the very fact that there are all these restrictions leads the Breita to state that there never has been, or according to the other opinion, it's rare, but it has happened, that there's been an adjudicated case of a disloyal and defiant son, and there never will be. And so at first reading, it seems puzzling that the oral law should actively minimize the application of biblical law to such an extent that the law could never be carried out. Why? I would suggest that the essential message of the law of the wayward and defiant son, namely the protection of the child from absolute patriarchal authority, was also clearly understood by the Torah Sheba'al Peh and reflected in its teachings. This oral law, therefore, carried that tradition that we just became reacquainted with, so to speak, by becoming aware of this notion of complete patriarchic authority over one's children that was prevalent in the ancient Near East. And this is the reason that the limitations of applications to the law of the wayward son stipulated in the Mishnah are not simply gzerot hakatuv, a reading of the text itself, but rather these limitations introduce social aspects of the child's home environment, which may have led to his filial defiance by the oral law, as extenuating circumstances which may have caused the child to become wayward and defiant in his posture, not based solely on his own inclinations. For example, if a son grows up in a house in which parents do not speak the same voice, they are not suited for each other, their temperaments and so forth are different, in which is a house filled with strife, or if they are children of people with handicaps who in the ancient world did not command any respect from most of the society, then how could the law demand that the child obey and have respect for his parents? And so based on these cases, it seems that knowing the contextual background of the biblical law allows us to appreciate as an injunction to protect children from the abuse of patriarchal authority, of which the oral law was clearly cognizant of the Torah's primary consideration, the protection of the child from parental abuse. Thus, the law of the wayward and defiant son is a reminder to all of us today, as in past days, and it is as relevant to us in this 20th and 21st centuries, that it is not only a divine command to uphold the important virtue of respect and reverence for one's parents, but it is also a Torah value to be diligent in preventing children from being abused by abusive parents. I hope that this exercise today has not only given you an appreciation of the work of a Syriologist, of the importance of the study of laws as a means of understanding a society's law, and its cultural values within that society, but also some valuable insights into the study of the Torah Sheba'al Peh and the Torah Shebechtav, the written and oral law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eichler, for that highly informative presentation. Definitely a unique experience to see different angles of a text that many of us are familiar with. Just a couple of questions for you,
Sure.
being that it's not often that we have someone who has an expertise in your area. And I wanted to know if you could agree or disagree with the following assertion I once heard. I heard it from Rabbi Kleinman, who is the rabbi of Deret El on 29th Street for many, many, many decades.
Yes.
So he suggested that, aside from Avraham, instructing or enlightening the world into the topic of monotheism, he also instructed the world in terms of the character of God, because he said that the ancient idols had very often had a vicious or angry face upon them, and the goal or the effort amongst the people was to placate the gods so the gods wouldn't be angry at them. And Abraham, and aside from saying that there's one God, flipped it and says, no, God is actually a loving God, and he's not an angry God. He's a God that actually is a peaceful, merciful God. So this assertion that was suggested, that in addition to teaching a monotheism, he actually also taught about the nature of God, as opposed to trying to avoid God's wrath. God is actually a loving parent. I want to know if you had any thoughts about that argument, and you could agree or disagree based on your studies.
No, it's not a matter of agreeing or disagreeing. It's very clear that there are many fundamental differences between the biblical view of deity and that of the Mesopotamians, which are very fundamental. It's understanding that, I think the fundamental difference is the understanding that that the Torah gives us of God, who is totally other. He is outside of the universe as we experience. He is totally other. He is totally unique. And all the forces of the universe that we experience on Earth are basically all emanate from him. And therefore, the difference between monotheism and polytheism is not really the difference between an arithmetic difference, but it's really a difference, it's a redefinition of the term God. What is a God? What is a Godhead? Every Mesopotamian and polytheistic society has the gods already born into a pre-existing realm with cosmic forces. They're subject to the cosmic forces. They're subject to the natural cosmic forces of having to eat and sleep. They can be killed. They have passions that indicate that they are subject to these natural forces of the universe, and as well as the cosmic forces of fate, destiny, magic. They all have power over the gods. As for, there is a strong, in Mesopotamian religious text, of Enlil, who is viewed as the enemy of humankind. He is the one who brings the flood. He is the one who creates a lot of problems for humanity. And in fact, we have a bunch of rituals in which Mesopotamians try to placate him, so to assuage his wrath, which is evident when things are not working out well on Earth. And so there is that notion that's there, but there's also benevolent gods in Mesopotamia. There are the benevolent gods like Ea, who saves Utnapishtim from the flood by a ruse. He went against the oath of not telling anybody about Enlil's plans to destroy humankind, and he surreptitiously sent a message to Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian flood hero, and we do find him intruding, interacting, and helping humankind together with other gods of that kind. So I feel that it is true that Mesopotamia does have a view of a god, a wrathful, non-benevolent, malevolent god, or series sets of gods. But on the other hand, too, they do know of some benevolent gods.
Thank you. And in terms of the notion of chesed, we're taught as little kids that Abraham, taught people the value of chesed, of sharing what you have of others, even though they may not be deserving of it and they did not earn it. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, was there this assumption that giving out free handouts to those who are misfortunate that was not inherent value, or was there a
So,
concept of tzedakah back then?
right. There was a concept of tzedakah in ways not as ingrained as it is here in the Torah. Uh, we also, the problem in if you look at the Mesopotamian penitential literature, in which the sufferer cries out to God, why is he suffering? And then there's a question of theodicy, just like in the book of Eov, why is God punishing me? I've done everything right. We do have a whole series of vidui, of confessions, in which through a recitation of all the things that he did wrong, he confesses, and then hopes that, and there's a ritual of, as he enumerates them, he may take some wax off a statue of himself and throw it into the fire. In other cases, some other rituals, he peels an onion and places the onion representing that particular sin into the fire, and so on. The major problem, however, is that this ethical behavior takes place in a world in which there is no real certainty as to what pleases a God and what doesn't please a God. There is no direct divine charge that God issues and gives law and instruction. The law was man-made, and only the king had some insight into what that was. And in the refrain in the suffering righteous man who complains bitterly, his friends tell him when they comfort him, try to comfort him, they say, you know, who are you? First of all, you are a God, you are born and created from a guilty God. It was the blood of a guilty God that man was created from. And therefore you have guilt within you, similar to the notion of an original sin, so to speak. And therefore you cannot escape it. Secondly, how do you know what pleases God? You have no certainty, all right? And so therefore there's this anxiety that's produced. I mean, they had a moral wherewithal that they should not be oppressing the poor, they should be clothing the destitute and things like that. That's the job of the king, though, not necessarily the job of each individual. But some people who took their obligations seriously also want to square it with the gods as well, and their personal behavior could have been very ethical, but it guaranteed nothing. What it did, what they had is magic to kind of manipulate the gods because that was a real power. It was a cosmic force to them that through the priesthood and an Ea, the benevolent God, gave human beings the knowledge of that kind of manipulation. And therefore they could assure through certain rituals, fertility of the land. They thought that they could control certain things through magic, but they were well aware too that it didn't always work, and that they never really knew for certain what the God wanted out of humankind. In addition to that, there are many other gods, and the gods could be fighting for their lives. They're involved in other things, and even the gods themselves, when we have lamentations bringing about the destruction of cities in Mesopotamia, and each city was the estate of one of the major gods. And we have the destruction of Ur, which was the territory of the goddess Inanna. And she hears that the great gods, headed by Enlil, have decided to destroy Ur. And they pray to her, and she responds that she is powerless to do anything because the great gods have decreed it. And she cannot, and she then is forced to leave the city, because then when the city is destroyed, she has no food. She has to find herself another territory to be worshipped elsewhere in order to get all of her cultic needs, so to speak. So there's that terrible uncertainty that we have.
Thank you. One final question and we'll conclude. The Rambam very famously writes the evolution of idolatry, how idolatry came into the world. He says first, people, wanted to serve Hashem, but then that they noticed that Hashem gave certain powers to the moon and the sun and the stars because they have a certain degree of influence over the world. So they argued that a way of serving Hashem is also to serve those that he created in order to help for the world to function properly. And ultimately they forgot the origin. They only remembered the messengers, the emissaries, and not the origin of it all. So are you familiar where the Rambam developed this understanding of the appearance of idolatry in the world? And do you have any additional sources that could corroborate this explanation?
Right. Well, I always assumed that his major source was the Torah. When God created humankind, right, he spoke directly to humankind. He created humankind so that he can have an interaction with human beings. And it was very clear from the story of Breshit, which is fascinating in its own, side with the ancient Near Eastern material, as a comparison of how different those stories, those accounts are. We find that God is actually creating a world, not of Jews, but of humanity. And all people were to be able to had the potential to actually interact with him. And he so desired. And the only thing he desired from them was he gave them the world to be theirs, to master and to exploit for their benefits, and to derive all the goodness of the world. But he also gave them one law, which says that you shall not eat from this tree, which basically meant that you have to, despite the fact that you are the master of the world, so to speak, you are still a creature of the Creator. And therefore, you still have that responsibility to acknowledge that Creator. And therefore, obedience is the prime virtue that human beings can show to God. And that carries on. And we see that God has attempted in Torah itself to have a relationship with Adam. And then society came and he decided, he tried to have Noah was the only one, right? And so it seems that over time, that connection with God that God wanted and that recognition of a relationship that could be possible was somehow attenuated. And they could not, and human beings began, either because of the intensity or because they were overwhelmed by nature, began to feel that we'll create intermediaries, or we'll create gods themselves, thinking that they were because the abstractness of the biblical God is very hard for even us to conceive of, and so therefore it was very difficult. And whether they started using these intermediaries, that's one thing. And what's so interesting is that the use of intermediaries is very common in some of the stele inscriptions that we have. Most kings, unlike Hammurabi, who's there confronting Shamash, is presented to the god, to the great god, by his own personal god, as if to say he doesn't have easy access to the great gods, but he has his own personal god, and that personal god can help give him access. And it's there in the drawings where the king being led by the hand by his personal god, coming into the presence of one of the great gods. And so it's very difficult for human beings, I feel, to have understood this concept and appreciated the monotheistic concept of deity. And then you have, as Huchala Nirshukro, Shem Hashem and V'Yachel Ve'em became Chilon. That's basically also where Rambam gets that notion as well. And we see that God was disappointed in human beings, and after, many gave up on the idea of making himself known to all of the world, and settled on Abraham and his family to be the ones to carry the divine message to the world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eichler, for your time this morning, for this very informative and interesting presentation. And we want to thank you for your participation in the shul, the minyanim and everything. And please, God, only happy occasion for you and your family.
And we want to thank you for your leadership in this difficult time. Thank you. And to Rachel also for her work and the leadership role that she plays in the shul. Take care.
Most definitely. Thank you all for joining us. And we have more programming coming up in November on Sundays, fascinating events and opportunities. So thank you all for joining us once again, and have a wonderful week.